Hey everyone, welcome back to Medieval Historian. In today's video, we're diving into a topic that many don't know the full extent of: why medieval marriages were a trap. Unlike the romanticized versions we often hear, these unions were far from about love. They were carefully crafted power plays between families, designed to solidify alliances, secure wealth, and maintain control. Women were often betrothed before they even understood what love was, while men found themselves stuck in joyless partnerships with high stakes, where loyalty and survival came first. Now, think about modern marriages, relationships built on love, at least in theory, with personal choice and freedom at the core. But back then, it wasn't about love or choice, it was about survival and power. It's chilling to realize how little control many had over their own lives, especially when compared to what we have today. So, before we begin, and before you get too comfortable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? I'm just a nerd who loves digging into history's darkest corners, and it always blows my mind to see people tuning in from all over the world. Let's get into it. This is why medieval marriages were a trap. Medieval marriages were never about love. They were contract transactions, bartering children's futures for power, alliances, and control. Picture this. Young girls, often still in their teens or even younger, promised to men they had never met. Their marriages, set in motion long before they had a say in the matter, were dictated by the interests of their fathers, uncles, and even their grandfathers. In this world, love had no place. There was no room for tenderness or affection, only obligation and the cold, hard reality of political gain. These unions were designed to strengthen family positions, unite warring factions, or secure wealth. It wasn't about finding someone who shared your soul. It was about securing your legacy, your survival, and your status. The concept of love, as we understand it today, didn't exist in the medieval world. Instead, marriage was a tool and instrument to create power, manage land, and reinforce family ties. And women? They were the vessels through which these power plays were carried out. The idea of marrying for love seemed like an absurd fantasy to many during this time, with emotions seen as a liability, something that could weaken the strong foundations of duty and power that marriage was supposed to solidify. Marriage in the medieval world was a system that didn't care about the hearts of the individuals involved. It didn't care if you were in love with your spouse or if you even knew them at all. What mattered was the political gain, the alliances formed, the wealth secured, and the legacy continued. It's a brutal truth, but it's the truth. Women, in particular, were pawns in this game. Their worth wasn't tied to their emotional connections or personal desires, but to their ability to produce heirs and to solidify familial power. In many ways, the medieval world treated women's bodies like property tools to ensure a family's survival and success, but nothing more. They were expected to submit, to serve, to bear children, and to accept their roles without question. And men, despite wielding more power, often found themselves equally trapped by these unions. They, too, were bound by family obligations, political maneuvering, and the need to uphold a legacy, even at the expense of their happiness and desires. Medieval marriages, for both men and women, were prisons of a different kind where the shackles weren't iron, but promises made, alliances forged, and futures determined by the whims of the powerful. So, while we often romanticize marriage today as an act of love, the truth is that for most people in the medieval period, it was nothing more than a survival strategy, game of power and control, played out in the most intimate of ways. In the medieval world, marriage wasn't a partnership, it was a property exchange. The concept of property didn't just extend to land or goods, but also to people. Women were often treated as property, with their marriages seen as transactions to advance family wealth and status. It was a reality that transcended social classes. From peasants to kings, marriage was an exchange of value. This system was reinforced by the Church, which sanctified these unions, adding an air of divine legitimacy to the transaction. Families didn't marry off their daughters for love or personal choice. They married them off as one would an asset to be used strategically. Daughters were seen as bargaining chips, their worth measured not by their intellect or character, but by the dowries they brought, the alliances they could create, and the land they could secure. The idea that a woman could have any say in the matter was foreign. The only question that mattered was whether the match would benefit the family. If it did, then the union was approved, regardless of whether the bride had ever met her future husband. It was a brutal system where women's desires and feelings were ignored in favor of familial and political advantage. For the men involved, the situation was only marginally better. While they weren't usually subject to the same constraints as women, they still found themselves in relationships built on the shaky foundations of duty and obligation, not affection. They too were expected to serve the family, producing heirs, securing land, and strengthening alliances. Even love was seen as secondary, at best, to the political and social demands of marriage. In many cases, marriage was a matter of survival, securing the family name, strengthening alliances, or ensuring inheritance. A man's worth in a marriage wasn't determined by his character, but by his wealth, power, and ability to control land. And for women, it was even worse. Their worth was entirely transactional, measured in how much land, wealth, and influence they could bring to the table through their marriage. They were given away in exchange for these things, and their futures were sealed. In some ways, a medieval marriage was the ultimate form of ownership. Women were handed over from their fathers to their husbands, their autonomy erased, their futures dictated by men. For them, marriage was a trapone they couldn't escape. Their lives were dictated by their family's ambitions and the political landscape, leaving them little room for personal happiness. In the eyes of society, women weren't people, they were property to be used and traded for the benefit of the family. It wasn't just women who were treated this way, however. Men were similarly bound by duty, with little room to choose their partners based on affection. The cold, pragmatic world of medieval marriage left little room for the tender affection we associate with love today. It was all about property, power, and survival. And in this world, even the most personal of unions was determined by forces beyond the couple's control, leaving both men and women trapped in a cycle of obligation, duty, and survival, with little hope for escape. In medieval marriages, the dowry was not just a gift, it was the currency of power. The dowry was the most important factor in the union, with the wealth and land it brought often determining the future of the marriage. This wasn't just a sum of money, it was the foundation of the political strategy that surrounded the marriage. The wealth of a dowry was the weapon families wielded in this game of alliances, securing influence, land, and even military strength through the promise of wealth. For women, the dowry was the price they paid for their marriage, and it was more than just a symbol of their family's status. It was also a guarantee of their place in the marriage contract, binding them to a man they barely knew, a man who had been chosen for his ability to manage the wealth and lands that came with the union. When a woman was married off, her dowry was her worth. It dictated her status within the marriage and her position within society. It also determined the kind of life she would lead, whether she would live in luxury or face the brutal realities of a loveless, controlling union. The dowry often had the power to secure her survival, and in some cases, it was the only bargaining chip she had. A woman's role was defined by what she brought to the table, and that was usually a considerable amount of wealth and land. For men, the dowry was an enticing proposition and asset that enhanced their financial standing and social influence. However, this wasn't always a luxury. Many men, particularly those of noble birth, were also bound by the dowry system. They too had little say in their marriages, as their fathers and advisors would select brides based on the value of their dowry. These men didn't marry for love, nor did they marry for attraction. They married for the wealth, power, and stability that came with the dowry. The dowry was their ticket to greater land, resources, and control. But it came at a cost. These men were expected to manage their wives' families and their dowries effectively, ensuring that the wealth was maintained and that alliances were honored. The pressure on these men was immense, as failing to live up to these expectations could result in disgrace or the collapse of family power. What was often left out of the equation was the emotional well-being of either party. Men had their own emotional burdens, knowing their marriage was a business arrangement, no matter how many lavish feasts and celebrations were thrown to mark the occasion. They were bound by duty, and the woman who came with the dowry, although supposed to be a life partner, was instead a means to end a vessel through which the wealth of the family could be transferred and preserved. In this system, both women and men were trapped by the immense weight of the dowry. Women were valued less for who they were and more for the lands and riches they could bring. Men, on the other hand, were expected to manage that wealth while securing their family's future. For both, love was irrelevant. What mattered most was the contract, the dowry, and the political weight carried by the union. Love didn't stand a chance in the face of such cold, transactional arrangements. And in the end, the dowry was just one more reminder that marriage was about survival, not about finding a partner with whom you could share a life. In the medieval world, marriage was primarily a means to continue the family legacy, and there was no greater duty than bearing children, particularly male heirs. The idea of love between husband and wife was secondary to the imperative of producing offspring, especially sons. Women were expected to be fertile, to provide heirs who could inherit family titles, lands, and wealth, ensuring the family's future. This pressure was relentless, and for many women, it was the primary reason for their marriage. From the moment they were married, their worth was often measured by their ability to conceive. If they failed to do so, their position in the marriage could become precarious. In a time when lineage and bloodlines determined power, women who could not produce heirs were often seen as failures, their marriages at risk. The pressure placed on women to bear children, especially male heirs, was immense. Many medieval marriages were childless, and women who were unable to conceive were often blamed, with society assuming that the failure was entirely their fault. The constant expectation that a woman must bear children left little room for personal happiness or freedom. It was a duty, and failure to fulfill this duty was a stain on her reputation. For men, the responsibility to produce heirs was also an overwhelming burden. While they weren't expected to carry children, they were deeply invested in ensuring the succession of their family line. In fact, the marriage was often arranged with the sole purpose of securing heirs. The pressure on men to secure the family name through their wives and to ensure that their wealth and power passed to their children was immense. There was little room for personal desire in such unions. Even the emotional bond between husband and wife was secondary to this overriding obligation. The success or failure of the marriage was measured by the number and quality of heirs produced. Sons were the most important, as they would inherit the father's property and titles. In a time when land and titles were the primary sources of wealth and power, an heirless marriage could bring the family to ruin. In many cases, men had mistresses or second wives in order to ensure the birth of an heir if their first wife failed to provide one. This was often seen as a necessary act to preserve the family legacy, but it also reinforced the idea that love had little place in medieval marriages. It wasn't about emotional connection or affection, it was about continuing the bloodline. For both men and women, the duty of bearing children was the crux of marriage. Everything else, the wealth, the power, the alliances, was secondary to the continuation of the family name. This pressure weighed heavily on both parties, and it served as a constant reminder that marriage was never about love. It was about survival, legacy, and ensuring the family's future. Children, and particularly sons, were not just a blessing. They were the most important product of the marriage, the driving force behind everything. If a marriage failed to produce heirs, it was considered a failure. And for those who were unable to bear children, life within the marriage could quickly become unbearable, as the pressure and disappointment mounted with each passing year. For many women in the medieval world, the inability to bear children, especially male heirs, meant a life of silent grief. In a time when a woman's worth was measured by her ability to produce children, particularly sons, being childless was not just a personal sorrow, it was a societal failure. The medieval marriage system left women with little room for personal identity or fulfillment outside of motherhood. Women were defined by their roles as wives and mothers, and anything less was seen as a failure. The pressure to conceive was often immense. In some cases, women could be blamed for the failure to produce children, even though the cause of infertility could lie with their husbands. In a patriarchal society where men controlled the narrative, the blame was rarely shifted to them. If a woman didn't bear children, especially a son, she risked losing her place in the family and her marriage. Childlessness was often seen as a curse, and women who couldn't fulfill their role as mothers were seen as incomplete. The grief of being unable to bear children was compounded by the societal pressures placed on women to be fruitful, to produce heirs, to contribute to the family's legacy. Their pain went unspoken, buried beneath the weight of expectations and the cold reality of the world they inhabited. For many, this grief was a lifelong struggle. Women were often kept in isolation during their pregnancies, with little emotional support beyond the duty of bearing a child. In some cases, women who failed to produce children were relegated to the margins of their own families. They were seen as less valuable, their presence in the marriage rendered insignificant. The emotional toll of this treatment was devastating, and many women carried the sorrow of childlessness with them for their entire lives. It wasn't just about the desire to have a child, it was about the societal judgment that accompanied that failure. The medieval system didn't allow for personal feelings or the acknowledgement of a woman's emotional pain. Instead, it reinforced the idea that a woman's value was tied solely to her ability to produce heirs. If she couldn't do that, she had little to offer. This led to a culture of silent suffering for many women, whose emotional needs were never acknowledged, whose pain was never validated. Their grief was not recognized as legitimate. It was swept under the rug as an unfortunate circumstance, a failure in a world that cared only for the perpetuation of family names and wealth. Religion in the medieval period was inextricably tied to every aspect of life, including marriage. The church played an authoritative role in the establishment and maintenance of medieval marriages. It sanctified the union, declaring it a divine institution that could not be dissolved by human hands. While this concept of divine right gave marriages an air of solemnity, it also served to keep people trapped in loveless unions, particularly women. In the eyes of the church, a woman's role in marriage was primarily to be a dutiful wife, a mother, and a servant to her husband. Love was irrelevant. The church taught that marriage was a sacred duty, and personal happiness or affection were seen as secondary, even selfish desires. Once a woman entered into a marriage, she was bound to her husband, and the church made it very clear that divorce was not an option. This religious mandate often trapped women in abusive or unhappy marriages, as the church offered no escape for women who found themselves in harmful unions. Even in cases of infidelity or mistreatment, the religious institutions upheld the sanctity of marriage, leaving women with no recourse but to suffer in silence. The church also reinforced the idea that marriage was for procreation. It wasn't just about companionship, it was about the continuation of the family line and the salvation of the soul. Children were seen as gifts from God, and their birth was not just a personal joy but a divine blessing that confirmed the legitimacy of the marriage. For women, this only deepened their burden. Not only were they expected to fulfill their duties as wives, but they were also tasked with bearing children, especially sons, to fulfill God's plan. The Church's teachings placed immense pressure on women to conform to this ideal. Failure to do so was not only a personal disappointment, it was a failure in the eyes of God. Men were also affected by the Church's role in marriage, though they had more power and freedom within the union. Men could often take mistresses or second wives if the first was unable to bear children, a practice that was sanctioned by the Church. The Church's double standards reinforced the idea that women were subordinate to their husbands, their worth defined by their ability to produce heirs, while men had the freedom to take other wives if necessary. This religious framework, which governed the lives of medieval couples, only served to deepen the oppression of women and reinforce the transactional nature of marriage. In the medieval world, a wife's autonomy was non-existent. A woman, once married, was legally and socially bound to her husband in every aspect of life. The very concept of personal freedom or independence was alien to the medieval wife. Her primary role was to serve her husband, to manage his household, and to bear his children. Everything else was secondary. A woman's identity was largely defined by her husband, her family, and the social structure that placed women under the authority of men. Marriage was a contract, but it was a one-sided one where the woman gave up her rights, her future, and her identity in exchange for the security of a roof over her head and a place in the family's lineage. It was a trade where love or affection had no place, and personal will was irrelevant. Wives had little to no say in the decisions that affected their lives. They could not choose their partners, negotiate the terms of their marriages, or even control their financial destiny. All wealth, land, and property that they brought into the marriage were typically controlled by their husbands. The only things women could truly call their own were their children, and even that was dictated by the husband's desire for heirs. For the majority of women, this lack of autonomy was a lifelong struggle. Medieval wives had no legal standing outside of their husband's authority. If they were abused, mistreated, or neglected, there was no recourse for them in society or the law. In a world that valued land, wealth, and power above all else, the position of the wife was as disposable as the assets she brought into the marriage. If a wife failed in her duty to produce heirs, particularly male heirs, she could be discarded or even sent away to live in isolation, depending on her husband's whims. Women in such marriages had no voice, no freedom, and were often completely dependent on the goodwill of their husbands, which was often in short supply. The medieval wife was not a partner, but an extension of the household, a means of securing the family's future, and little more. This lack of autonomy didn't just affect the individual woman, it affected the very fabric of medieval society. It reinforced the rigid, patriarchal structure of the time, where women had little room for self-determination. Their bodies, their choices, and their futures were not their own. For many women, their entire lives were spent in service to their husbands, working to ensure their family's survival and to preserve their husband's status. It was a life that demanded constant sacrifice, with little recognition or reward. And in this world, the very idea of a woman's happiness or emotional fulfillment was foreign. She was an object, a tool, used for the continuation of the family's name and legacy, and her desires were cast aside in favor of the needs of those more powerful than her. Divorce was almost unheard of in the medieval period. For many medieval couples, the idea of ending a marriage was unthinkable. The Church's stance on marriage was clear. It was a sacred, lifelong commitment that could only be dissolved by death. For women, the fear of rejection and the potential for being cast aside in a marriage was an ever-present fear. If a woman failed in her duties, whether it was producing heirs, managing the household, or living up to her husband's expectations, she could be discarded, leaving her destitute and shunned by society. In a world where women had no legal standing of their own, divorce was not an option. A woman who was cast aside by her husband had few choices. She could either live out the rest of her life in poverty, in isolation, or, if fortunate, be remarried. However, Even remarriage was difficult, as society had a harsh judgment of women who had been discarded by their first husbands. They were seen as damaged goods, and their chances of finding another marriage were slim. This fear of being rejected by her husband was a constant source of anxiety for medieval women. They knew that their worth was tied to their ability to fulfill their role in the marriage, and the consequences of failing in this duty were severe. For many women, this meant a life of unspoken suffering, as they struggled to meet the impossible expectations placed upon them. They were often left with no outlet for their pain or frustration, as societal norms prevented them from speaking out. In many cases, they had no choice but to endure the consequences of their failed marriages, whether it meant living in silence or becoming the subject of gossip and scorn. The lack of recourse for women in these marriages created a toxic cycle, where women were trapped by their inability to divorce and forced to suffer in silence. This fear of rejection and the absence of legal protection for women contributed to the deeply oppressive nature of medieval marriage, where personal happiness was often sacrificed for the survival of the family and the perpetuation of its wealth and power. For men, the situation was slightly different, but still rooted in fear. If a marriage failed to produce heirs, or if a wife was unable to fulfill her role, men could also find themselves under pressure. A man's honor, legacy, and wealth were often at stake, and a marriage that failed to produce children could ruin a family. While men had more freedom than women in these situations, their social standing and future were still at risk if their marriages failed. But unlike women, men had more freedom to seek second marriages or even take mistresses, securing heirs outside of their first marriage. Women, on the other hand, faced the harsh reality of having little to no recourse. The social stigma surrounding failed marriages was particularly difficult for women to bear. They were expected to bear the brunt of failure in ways that men were not, creating a system where women were both expected to stay and suffer in marriages that often failed to meet their emotional or personal needs. In medieval times, marriages were often nothing more than a strategic alliance, a way to secure power and wealth through the union of two families. The concept of romantic love was irrelevant, and the feelings of the individuals involved were of little concern. Marriages were treated as business transactions, agreements forged in the dark corridors of power, where the stakes were high, and personal happiness had no place. Families used marriages to expand their territories, gain military support, and cement political alliances. A noble family might offer their daughter in marriage to a neighboring lord or prince in exchange for military protection, land, or influence. For women, this was an unavoidable reality. Marrying for love wasn't even a consideration. It was about survival, about what family she was born into, and the role she could play in securing the family's future. These marriages were often arranged when the bride was still a child, leaving little room for her to express her own desires, let alone choose her partner. The decision was made by her father or male guardians, who weighed the political and financial benefits of the marriage above all else. The concept of a choice in marriage was an illusion for medieval women. They were pawns in the political chess game, used to strengthen family ties and improve the family's position within the realm. Men, too, were often caught in these political marriages. While they had more agency in the decision-making process than women, their choices were still restricted by the political landscape. A nobleman couldn't simply marry for love, he had to consider the alliances he could form through marriage. Marrying a woman from a powerful family could secure his position, open doors to new opportunities, and grant him access to land and resources. These unions were seen as a necessary step for maintaining and building power, rather than a personal choice. Just like the women, men were expected to put aside any personal preferences and accept the union as a means to an end. Even if there was no affection between husband and wife, the political alliance remained the driving force. Personal happiness and love were luxuries that most could not afford. The union was not about two people coming together for mutual companionship, but rather about the consolidation of power. These forced alliances had a deep impact on the emotional lives of those involved. For women, it meant being sold into a life of servitude and obedience, while for men, it often meant facing the pressures of managing the consequences of a loveless marriage, where personal desires and affections were pushed aside in favor of ambition. The dowry system, which was central to medieval marriages, often reflected the brutal reality women faced in these unions. It was not just a transfer of wealth, but a mark of ownership. A woman's worth was tied directly to the dowry her family provided, often in the form of land, livestock, money, or precious goods. This system stripped women of their autonomy, turning them into commodities that could be traded or exchanged in the name of securing alliances and power. Once a woman married, her dowry often became the property of her husband, giving him control over her wealth, land, and resources. In some cases, the dowry was so significant that it could dictate the terms of the marriage, especially if the woman's family was more powerful than the husband's. The dowry was seen as the payment for her hand in marriage, and it was a price that was often too high for many women to bear. Women were expected to be grateful for the security that marriage provided, but the reality was that the dowry only reinforced their subjugation. It gave men an immense amount of power over them, and the women were left with little to no control over their own futures. The dowry also created a deeply transactional view of marriage, where the emotional connection between husband and wife was secondary to the financial arrangement. For many women, their dowry was their only form of protection, and without it, they were left vulnerable. A woman's marriage could be dissolved if her dowry was deemed insufficient or if the marriage had failed to produce the necessary heirs. In some cases, if the wife's family could not pay the agreed-upon dowry, the marriage could be annulled, leaving the woman destitute and often disgraced. Women who were caught in this system found themselves trapped, as the financial burden of their dowries and the promise of wealth or land placed their futures firmly in the hands of their husbands. The dowry system perpetuated a cycle of control and dependence, where women had no choice but to submit to the terms of the marriage, regardless of how they felt about it. They had no voice, no say in how their lives were shaped by the dowry, and the consequences of failing to fulfill the obligations of the marriage were often devastating. For men, the dowry system was a way to ensure that the wealth and power of the family would be passed on, and it created an expectation that the marriage would benefit both parties financially. While men had the freedom to take control of the dowry, it was also a weight that they had to manage, particularly if the dowry didn't live up to expectations. They too faced pressure to make the marriage successful, as their social standing depended on it. Yet for both parties, the dowry system reinforced the cold, transactional nature of marriage. Love had no place in these unions. It was all about wealth, power, and survival. The dowry system locked women into a cycle of dependency and subjugation, where they were valued for what they could provide financially rather than for their emotional or intellectual worth. And for men, it created a constant pressure to fulfill the promises of their marriage, securing their family's future by any means necessary. In the medieval world, the husband held absolute power over the marriage and his wife. Marriage, as defined by both the church and society, placed the man at the top of the hierarchy, and the wife was expected to serve him in all aspects of life. A husband's authority in the marriage was not just a matter of societal norms, it was often enforced by legal and religious principles. In a time when women had few rights, the marriage contract, particularly for women, was a one-sided affair, and it was men who held the reins. Men were the heads of their households, and the wife's duty was clear: to obey, serve, and produce children. Any woman who failed to meet these expectations could face harsh consequences, both from her husband and from society at large. The law and the church reinforced the notion that the husband was the ultimate authority in the household. He had the right to make decisions regarding finances, land, and children, while the wife had little say in any of these matters. If a woman displeased her husband, Whether by failing to fulfill her duties or by failing to meet his expectations, she had few legal or social protections. She could be punished, scorned, or even cast aside, leaving her destitute and vulnerable. For a medieval husband, this power was both a privilege and a burden. He was responsible for the family's survival, wealth, and legacy. The weight of the family name rested on his shoulders, and the decisions he made regarding his wife's role were critical. If the marriage failed, if his wife didn't bear him children or didn't manage the household properly, the responsibility would fall on him. However, even though he had control over nearly every aspect of the marriage, the husband's authority often led to stress and resentment. His wife's inability to fulfill her duties reflected poorly on him and his family. Still, he had the final word, and the relationship was always shaped by his needs and desires. In many cases, a husband could take multiple wives or concubines to secure heirs or gain additional wealth. This further reinforced his power and gave him more freedom to secure the family's future. The concept of a woman having any control over the marriage was foreign in the medieval world. This imbalance of power made marriage a dangerous institution for many women, as their futures were entirely dependent on the whims of their husbands. Childbirth, in the medieval period, was an incredibly dangerous and painful ordeal, particularly for women in arranged marriages who had no say in their reproductive choices. For many, childbirth was seen as a woman's primary duty, and failing to bear children, especially male heirs, was a personal and social disaster. The medical knowledge of the time was rudimentary at best, and many women died in childbirth due to complications that could easily have been avoided with modern medical practices. The physical pain of childbirth was excruciating, and the fear of death lingered over every woman as she gave birth. Medieval women had little to no control over the number of children they bore, and in many cases they were expected to produce a child every year, creating a constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. The pressure to bear children was immense, especially in noble families where producing heirs was of paramount importance. A woman who failed to do so was seen as useless, and in some cases could be discarded or cast aside in favor of a more fertile bride. The lack of birth control and the constant demands of the marriage created an overwhelming burden on women, leaving them vulnerable to physical, emotional, and social harm. In addition to the physical risks, childbirth also brought with it immense emotional suffering. Women were often isolated during childbirth, surrounded only by midwives or servants. The absence of supportive care meant that women had to face the trauma and the fear of childbirth alone. In some cases, a woman could be left to deliver a child without any assistance if the family or estate could not afford a midwife or doctor. Childbirth, then, became not just a physical trial, but an emotional one as well. For many women, their worth was tied to their ability to give birth, and those who failed to produce children often lived with the weight of that failure for the rest of their lives. Some women even resorted to desperate measures to control their pregnancies, fearing the consequences of childbirth in a society that valued them only for their reproductive capabilities. This hidden suffering was an integral part of the medieval marriage system, and it remains a silent story for many women of that era that was never openly acknowledged, but felt in every moment of pain, isolation, and fear. Infertility in the medieval period was not only a personal tragedy, but a social one. For women trapped in the expectations of medieval marriage, the inability to bear children, particularly male heirs, was an unbearable weight. The pressure placed on women to produce children was immense. If a wife failed to conceive, or worse, failed to give birth to a son, the consequences could be devastating. A woman's worth was often tied to her reproductive abilities, and infertility was seen as a failure in her duty to her husband and family. In the harsh eyes of society, a woman who failed in her role as a mother could be discarded or ostracized. The notion that a woman could not bear children was often seen as a reflection of her inadequacy, and there was little understanding or compassion for the complexity of fertility. Infertility was often blamed on the wife, with the husband's inability to father children rarely questioned. For women, this created a world where they were seen only as vessels for producing heirs, and any failure in that regard was seen as a personal flaw that had the potential to ruin their marriage and future. The grief that came with infertility was silent. Women were expected to continue with their marriages, fulfilling their duties to the household, without the space or time to mourn the loss of their dreams for a family. The emotional and physical toll of being repeatedly pregnant, only to miscarry or bear a stillborn child, added to the suffering. In a world that offered little comfort, these women were expected to soldier on, their grief never acknowledged, their pain never shared. The lack of emotional support for women facing infertility left many to suffer in isolation, unable to express the devastation that came with being unable to fulfill what was perceived as their primary purpose. Many women lived with the fear that their husbands might grow tired of waiting for children and that they might be cast aside in favor of a younger, more fertile wife. The failure to produce children often led to feelings of shame, guilt, and unspoken sorrow. It was a reality that women were forced to carry alone, without the understanding or compassion that might have allowed them to cope with such deep and personal grief. The medieval church played a central role in marriages, not just as an institution of religious authority, but as a key player in dictating the structure of marriage, its expectations, and its consequences. Marriage, for the church, was a sacred sacrament, a divine command, and as such, it was not meant to be broken. For the church, marriage was about much more than the emotional or social connection between husband and wife. It was about creating and preserving lineage, securing the family, and ensuring that the power and wealth of the nobility remained intact. The church viewed marriage as a contract that not only united two people but also two families, and in this sense, the church's role was intertwined with the political and economic realities of the time. The church set the rules, dictated the ceremonies, and determined the legitimacy of children. Its views on marriage were often rigid and unyielding, leaving little room for personal choice, particularly for women. The church's stance on divorce was especially harsh. While annulments could be granted under rare circumstances, divorce was almost unheard of. The church's refusal to accept divorce meant that a woman who found herself in a loveless or abusive marriage had few options but to endure. This made medieval marriages even more suffocating for women, as they were bound not only by the expectations of their husbands and families, but by the sacred power of the church. The church also had significant influence over the emotional and spiritual aspects of marriage. Couples were taught to believe that their union was divinely ordained, that they were partners in God's plan, and that breaking that bond was not only a betrayal of their partner but a betrayal of God's will. This belief made it incredibly difficult for individuals, particularly women, to leave a marriage. The guilt and shame associated with divorce or separation were magnified by the church's teachings, and many women were forced to endure unspeakable hardships, whether it was physical abuse, emotional neglect, or the suffocating weight of an unfulfilling marriage. The idea of personal happiness or emotional fulfillment was not even a consideration. What mattered most was obedience to the church's doctrine. The church's influence was a powerful tool in keeping women subjugated in their marriages, making it nearly impossible for them to seek autonomy or escape from an unhealthy or oppressive situation. The church's view of marriage as a permanent and sacred bond ensured that most medieval marriages remained intact, even if they were marked by sorrow and suffering. It also helped to perpetuate a system where women were seen as subordinate, bound to their husbands in a life of duty and sacrifice, and left with no legal recourse if their marriage became unbearable. In the medieval world, where marriages were often political arrangements and personal desires were suppressed, the mistress played a crucial yet complex role. While the primary wife was expected to fulfill the duties of marriage-producing heirs, managing the household, and maintaining the family's reputation, the mistress was often seen as a symbol of forbidden love, a private escape from the harsh realities of marital obligation. For men in power, the mistress was a necessary indulgence, a way to experience affection, pleasure, and companionship that their wives could not provide. Often, these mistresses were young, beautiful women, sometimes from lower social classes, who were chosen not only for their looks, but for their ability to provide emotional relief from the political and familial burdens placed on the husband. For the men, the mistress was an escape, a chance to enjoy moments of tenderness and passion, free from the cold, transactional nature of their primary marriage. Yet, this relationship was fraught with power imbalances and risks, as the husband held all the power in the affair, while the mistress's position in society was precarious. The role of the mistress was far more than just an affair or a mere distraction. Often, these women held a hidden power that came with their position. A mistress, especially one who gained favor with her lover, could wield influence behind the scenes, using her relationship to secure advantages for her family or herself. She could act as a mediator in political disputes, manipulate the flow of information, and sometimes even sway the decisions of powerful men. A clever mistress could maneuver within the complex social and political webs of medieval life to amass power and wealth. However, this power was precarious at best. A mistress was always at the mercy of her lover's whims, and when the affair ended, whether due to the man's death, a shift in his political fortunes, or the arrival of a younger, more appealing woman, her position could be ruined. She was never fully protected, and her influence was built on sand. Yet, for many women in this position, the mistress was one of the few ways they could exercise some degree of control over their lives in a world that offered them few choices. Her relationship with the man could be an avenue for financial stability, protection, and status, even if it was temporary. In the medieval period, being close to power was both a privilege and a dangerous game. For women in marriages, this proximity often meant living in the shadow of a powerful man, whether as a wife, a mistress, or a subject. The closer a woman was to power, the more likely she was to be embroiled in the deadly games of court politics. Nobility and royalty lived in a world where betrayal was a constant, and everyone, no matter their gender, had a role to play in the ongoing dramas of power and succession. The proximity to power meant that women in these marriages were not only subject to the whims of their husbands, but also to the ambitions of those around them. The dynamics of court politics often forced women into situations where their loyalty was tested, and their worth was measured by their usefulness to the political aims of their families or husbands. The danger of living close to power was especially acute for women, as their primary role in marriage was often to secure alliances and bear children. Their personal safety was always at risk, as their lives were tied to the political fortunes of their husbands. If a husband fell from grace, whether through losing a battle, making a political misstep, or facing a rebellion, his wife and children were often swept into the fallout. Noble women were frequently held hostage or forced into uncomfortable political alliances to secure their husband's power or appease rival factions. Even a successful marriage could turn into a dangerous situation if the political landscape shifted. Women were often pawns in a larger game, caught between the struggle for power and the need to secure their family's position in the court. Proximity to power meant that they could easily become targets for manipulation, betrayal, and even violence, as factions vied for control. For these women, survival was not guaranteed on wrong move, one act of betrayal, and they could find themselves cast aside or even worse. In medieval marriages, especially among the nobility, the expectations placed upon women were immense and unyielding. The role of a wife was not just a personal commitment to her husband, but a societal and familial obligation that shaped her every move. These women were often seen as instruments for political gain, married off at a young age to strengthen family alliances, secure wealth, or preserve noble bloodlines. Once wed, Their primary duty was to produce heirs, particularly male heirs, to continue the family name and preserve its power. The weight of this responsibility bore down heavily on them, as their entire identity was tied to their role as a wife and mother. While men could engage in the public and political spheres, women were confined to their homes, expected to manage the household, raise children, and be the moral backbone of their family. Yet, beyond these duties, there was little room for personal ambition or desires. Women were not encouraged to pursue their own passions or seek fulfillment outside the constraints of their marriage. The needs of their family were always paramount, and the pressure to maintain this status quo created a life of unspoken suffering for many. The societal and familial pressure on women was especially intense during times of crisis. Whether a famine, a war, or a political scandal, the women in these marriages had to remain steadfast, appearing strong and dutiful, even when their hearts were breaking. They were expected to present an image of perfection, always graceful and composed, regardless of the emotional or physical toll their lives took on them. Their ability to bear children, especially sons, became a mark of their worth, and failure in this area often meant a lifetime of regret and shame. In these families, the wife's personal happiness, if it existed at all, was secondary to the family's public image and the perpetuation of its legacy. For many women, marriage meant the end of their personal identity, as they were swallowed up by the expectations of their husbands and families. Their lives became a continuous performance, one in which failure to meet expectations could result in alienation, ridicule, or worse. The weight of familial expectation was an unspoken burden, one that shaped every aspect of their existence and left them with little room to find their own voice. Medieval marriages, particularly those among the nobility, were steeped in an overwhelming imbalance of power, where women were often seen as property, their worth defined solely by their ability to serve their husbands, produce children, and manage the household. These marriages were rarely about love or mutual respect, but about social contracts and political alliances, which placed women in the unenviable position of subservience. The husband, as the head of the household, wielded absolute power. He had control over financial decisions, the household's resources, and even the lives of his wife and children. His word was law, and the wife had little to no say in the running of the household or the decisions made within it. Women, though often well educated, were still restricted by the roles society expected them to play. The wife's role was mainly limited to the private sphere. She was expected to maintain the household, support her husband's career, and bear children, but never to lead, negotiate, or have any real influence outside of the home. In this system, men were free to exert authority over their wives, often treating them as mere extensions of themselves. The idea of consent or mutual respect was foreign in many marriages, and the voice of the wife was not one that was heard or considered. Husbands were expected to maintain power over every aspect of their wives' lives, including their personal autonomy. This imbalance created a system where women had no agency, no control over their destinies, and were forced to conform to the roles assigned to them. In some cases, husbands could even take on multiple wives or concubines, further diminishing the wife's position in the marriage. Women had little recourse if their husbands were abusive or neglectful, and they were expected to endure the hardships of their marriages in silence. The imbalance of power in medieval marriages was not just a product of personal relationships, but was deeply rooted in the very fabric of medieval society and law. It created a system in which women were trapped, with little hope of escape or change, their voices silenced in a world that saw them only as wives and mothers, not as individuals with their own desires or ambitions. Widowhood in the medieval period carried with it a significant societal stigma, particularly for women of noble birth. A woman's value in marriage was almost entirely tied to her ability to be a wife and mother. So when a woman was widowed, especially at a young age, she was often left in a precarious position. The loss of her husband meant not only the loss of a partner, but the potential loss of her social standing, wealth, and security. Widows were often seen as vulnerable and exposed, and society did little to ease their burden. In many cases, widows were expected to mourn their husbands for a certain period, often dictated by the church, but were also quickly pressed to remarry to maintain their family's status and financial security. The social expectations surrounding widowhood were rigid, as widows had to balance their mourning with the pressure to marry again. While marriage could offer some security, it also came with a new set of challenges, particularly if the widow was already burdened by children or previous family obligations. The idea that a widow could live a life independent of remarriage was unheard of in medieval society. For women who were widowed at a young age, this pressure was even more intense. Many found themselves trapped in a cycle of grief and duty, unable to process the loss of their husband before being forced into another marriage. Furthermore, widows were often seen with suspicion by society, particularly if they were not in mourning long enough or if they remarried too quickly. This suspicion often translated into societal isolation and judgment, as if a woman's mourning process was not genuine or complete. In a world where women had so few rights and little personal agency, widowhood could feel like a double-edged sword. The freedom of being unmarried was often overshadowed by the stigma and the constant pressure to marry again, either for financial stability, political reasons, or to regain a sense of purpose and respectability. The plight of the widow was not just a personal grief, it was a social one, marked by shame, judgment, and limited choices, making it yet another example of how medieval society constrained women's autonomy. In medieval society, the fear of being unmarried was almost as great as the fear of being married to the wrong person. Women, particularly those of noble birth, were often seen as incomplete without a husband. Marriage was not a personal choice, but a societal expectation, a contract meant to ensure the continuation of family bloodlines and the securing of political alliances. For women, the idea of remaining unmarried was not just seen as unusual, but as a scandal. A woman who was not married or did not have children was considered unfulfilled, useless, and outside the norm. This intense societal pressure often led to women entering marriages with little regard for their own desires, as their value was intrinsically tied to their roles as wives and mothers. The fear of being unmarried, of not being able to fulfill these societal expectations, was a constant source of anxiety. Women who remained unmarried were often seen as failures, and for many, the threat of never marrying was a deep-seated fear that loomed over them throughout their lives. The fear of being unmarried was particularly acute for women in the nobility, where marriage was a strategic tool for securing alliances, consolidating power, and maintaining family wealth. Unmarried women, particularly those without heirs, were seen as weak links in the chain of succession, and their value to the family diminished without a husband. These women were often left to wait for a match arranged by their families, sometimes enduring years of uncertainty while they faced the constant pressure of being seen as failures in the eyes of their peers. Many women who were forced to wait for marriage felt as if their futures were slipping away, their lives on hold while their families tried to find them suitable matches. This fear was particularly terrifying because, in many cases, a woman's ability to marry well into wealth and power determined her entire future. A woman who was not married off to the right person could find herself and her family ostracized, left without social or political standing. The fear of being unmarried, of being left behind, was a powerful motivator that kept women in a constant state of anxiety, as they were forced to conform to the marriage expectations of their society, even at the expense of their own happiness. In medieval marriages, particularly among the nobility, the pressure to produce heirs was immense and inescapable. A woman's primary duty within her marriage was to bear children, and her worth was often measured by her ability to provide a male heir to carry on the family name and legacy. The birth of a son was not just a personal joy for a couplet, was a political event, a victory in the ongoing battle for power and land. For women, this pressure was overwhelming. The societal expectations surrounding fertility were strict, and failure to produce heirs could result in scandal, humiliation, and even the collapse of a noble house. A woman who failed to provide a son was seen as worthless, and her inability to fulfill this most important duty could lead to abandonment or divorce. Even if a woman did bear children, the pressure didn't end there. Each birth was scrutinized, and a noblewoman was expected to keep producing heirs until the family's future was secure. This constant expectation of reproduction created an environment where women's bodies were treated as tools for political advancement, leaving them with little to no autonomy over their reproductive choices. This intense pressure often caused women to suffer physically and emotionally. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous and exhausting, and many women died during childbirth or suffered permanent health complications. Yet, the fear of being unable to produce heirs kept many women trapped in this cycle. For some women, the desire for a male heir became an obsession, as the family's survival and their own place within society depended on it. In some cases, men would take multiple wives or mistresses to ensure the production of male heirs, further exacerbating the wife's sense of powerlessness. The concept of love, mutual respect, or personal happiness was secondary to the ultimate goal of securing the family's future. In a world where a woman's worth was directly tied to her ability to bear children, especially sons, marriage was not just a personal union, but a factory for the next generation. It was a responsibility that often stripped women of their autonomy, their health, and their well-being. In the medieval world, love had little to do with marriage. These unions were not founded on mutual affection or companionship, but on political, social, and economic necessity. Women were married off at young ages, often without having any say in the matter. They were mere pawns in the larger game of securing alliances, land, and wealth for their families. A marriage was a contract, a means to an end, and love was rarely, if ever, considered a necessary component. For noble families, the primary goal of marriage was to secure the family's power and future, not to create an environment of love and emotional connection. The concept of romantic love was a luxury that most women could never afford. They were expected to serve their husbands, manage their households, and bear children, all while remaining loyal, respectful, and dutiful. In return, they received security, wealth, and status, but love was not part of the equation. This absence of love often created marriages that were cold and transactional, where the partners hardly knew one another and had no emotional connection. Women were expected to remain silent and obedient, their feelings irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. Many women found themselves trapped in these joyless unions, with no outlet for their own desires or needs. They were expected to perform their roles flawlessly, keeping up appearances and maintaining the illusion of a harmonious family, even when their personal lives were filled with loneliness, frustration, and resentment. In a world where marriage was a political and social contract, the emotional and personal needs of women were secondary. Women in medieval marriages were often expected to suppress their own feelings, desires, and hopes in favor of fulfilling their duties. The absence of love in these marriages left many women feeling empty and unfulfilled, trapped in a world where their worth was determined by their ability to bear children and fulfill their husband's desires. In the medieval period, marriage was not merely a personal union between two individuals. It was a strategic alliance between families. Women, particularly those in noble and royal families, were often used as tools in these political transactions. Their primary purpose was to forge alliances, secure power, and ensure the survival of their family's political interests. A woman's role in marriage was to be the obedient wife, who would manage the household and produce heirs. However, beyond this, her value was directly tied to her family's ability to maintain their political standing. For many women, the concept of love was almost non-existent in their marriages. Instead, They were given in marriage as bargaining chips, meant to solidify political power or ensure military support from another noble house. A woman's personal feelings or desires were secondary to the needs of her family, and her role in the marriage was strictly defined by the political goals of the union. In this world, the women were often married off at young ages to men who they had no emotional connection with. The groom, who was usually much older and sometimes already married, would marry for the sake of securing a political advantage or consolidating power. For women, there was little room for personal choice or emotional bonds. Their marriages were often arranged long before they reached the age of understanding. By the time they were old enough to grasp the concept of love or affection, they were already wed, often to a man who saw them as a means to an end. Their beauty, intelligence, and character had little to no impact on the marriage. They were valued for their family's bloodline, their ability to produce heirs, and their role in strengthening the political influence of their husband. These women were expected to endure long periods of emotional isolation, for their husband's attention was often elsewhere. If they were lucky, they might have a small circle of friends or confidants, but their social interactions were tightly controlled by their husbands or families. In cases where the marriage was politically driven, affection or emotional connection took a back seat. The focus was always on maintaining the family's status, wealth, and power. The women were often forced to navigate their marriages with a stoic endurance, suppressing their personal feelings in favor of fulfilling the roles they were assigned. Despite the immense challenges they faced, these women were expected to smile and maintain grace, presenting an image of an ideal wife and mother, even if they felt little connection to the man they were married to. The political manipulation of women through marriage was a practice that endured for centuries, as families and kingdoms sought to cement their power at any cost. Life for a noble woman in medieval times was far from the romanticized notion of privilege and luxury. While women in noble families were often afforded the comforts of wealth and status, they were simultaneously bound by strict expectations and societal constraints. From a young age, noble women were trained in the arts of etiquette, household management, and social conduct, but they were rarely given the opportunity to explore their own interests or passions. Their lives were defined by duty, often centered around the family home, the hearth, and the care of children. They were seen as the moral pillars of their households, expected to maintain order, decorum, and loyalty within the family structure. However, beyond this role, the personal autonomy of noble women was severely restricted. Their social interactions, their movements, and even their personal choices were often governed by the wishes of their fathers, brothers, or husbands. In many ways, noble women were viewed as little more than property, their worth determined by their beauty, virtue, and ability to produce heirs. Their marriages were often arranged by their families, and once married, they were expected to uphold the dignity and honor of their household at all costs. They were tasked with managing the family estate, overseeing servants, and ensuring that the household ran smoothly, all while maintaining an air of grace and dignity. Yet, for many women, the reality of this life was harsh and isolating. They were confined to domestic roles, unable to pursue education, political power, or personal fulfillment. Even their relationships with their children were often based on duty rather than affection, as they were expected to bear heirs for the family, often at the cost of their own health and well-being. The rigid societal structures that defined medieval noble life placed noble women in a perpetual state of servitude, where their personal desires were secondary to the needs of the family and the household. Though they may have lived in castles and enjoyed material comforts, the emotional and intellectual limitations of their lives were stifling. Many women found themselves trapped in marriages that offered little emotional support, where the expectations placed upon them as wives and mothers were overwhelming. They were often seen as mere extensions of their husbands, their identities defined by their roles within the family. Despite their outward appearances of wealth and privilege, the emotional and psychological cost of these marriages often left women feeling hollow and isolated. as their personal needs and desires were constantly overlooked in favor of fulfilling societal expectations. In medieval marriages, especially among the nobility, obedience and submission were considered the virtues that defined a wife's character. The role of a wife was strictly delineated by societal expectations, and the foundation of this role rested on her ability to remain obedient to her husband, her family, and the broader societal structures. Women were not seen as equals to their husbands but as subordinates, whose value was tied to their ability to fulfill their duties without question. In marriage, women were expected to submit to their husband's authority, following the dictates of his will, whether it was managing the household, caring for children, or even more deeply personal matters. Any resistance to this submission was often met with harsh social consequences, leaving women with little room for personal freedom or expression. The concept of submission was not just a personal matter, it was a societal expectation. Medieval society, rooted in the teachings of the Church and the rigid structures of feudalism, viewed marriage as a divine institution, and the wife's submission to her husband was seen as a moral and religious obligation. The Bible was often quoted as a justification for a wife's duty to obey her husband, reinforcing the idea that a woman's place was within the home, working for the prosperity of her husband and his family. For women, this meant that marriage was not an opportunity to form a partnership based on mutual respect and affection. Instead, it was an obligation to submit to the will of the man who held the power. Women's obedience was often taken for granted. It was expected that a wife would submit to the decisions made by her husband, regardless of her own desires or opinions. This obedience was enforced not only through cultural norms but also through the threat of physical punishment, if necessary. In extreme cases, husbands had the legal right to punish their wives, reinforcing the patriarchal system of control. The very act of marriage stripped women of their autonomy and personal agency, forcing them into a cycle of obedience and submission that defined their lives. The idea of resisting or challenging this authority was unthinkable for most women. If a woman stepped outside her prescribed role or dared to challenge her husband, she faced the risk of being shunned, ostracized, or even worse, cast out from her family and society altogether. The boundaries of obedience and submission were not always as clear as they seemed. Many women, despite the limitations placed on them, found subtle ways to assert their power and influence within the confines of their roles. Some used their intelligence, charm, or wit to manipulate situations to their advantage. Others worked quietly behind the scenes, using their domestic authority to shape the political landscape of their households. Yet, for most, the pressure to submit to their husband's will left them with little room for personal growth or emotional fulfillment. Their marriages were not places of partnership or mutual respect, but rather environments in which they were expected to conform to rigid expectations, stifling their autonomy and creating a sense of internal conflict that was rarely acknowledged or addressed. Medieval marriages were often forced upon women, and this concept of forced marriage was deeply ingrained in the social fabric of the time. In many cases, young women had no say in whom they would marry, and these marriages were arranged by their families with little regard for the personal desires or happiness of the bride. The pressure to marry for family or political reasons was overwhelming, and the idea of love was often absent from these unions. For women, this meant a life bound to a man they had often never met, or one with whom they shared no emotional connection. The act of choosing a life partner was out of their hands. Instead, they were handed over to a man, not because of mutual affection, but because of family strategy, wealth, or power. For women of noble birth, this practice was particularly harsh, as the marriage often served as a tool to secure alliances, land, or power. These women were seen as commodities to be traded, their worth calculated by the political and financial advantages their marriage could bring. The forced nature of these unions left many women feeling trapped, powerless, and emotionally abandoned. In these marriages, Their personal happiness and emotional well-being were secondary to the political and familial goals of the men who controlled their lives. Many women entered marriages with little more than the hope that they might find a sliver of comfort or happiness amidst the rigid expectations that surrounded them. The psychological toll of these forced marriages was immense. Many women entered their marriages in fear, not knowing what to expect from their new husbands. Some were married to men much older than themselves, often with no prior emotional connection. The lack of consent in these marriages created an environment of emotional isolation and repression. Women were expected to submit to their husband's authority, whether or not they were treated with kindness or respect. The lack of autonomy and personal agency left women in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing if their needs or desires would ever be acknowledged. The isolation often deepened over time, with little opportunity for emotional support or personal expression. Despite the harsh conditions, many women learned to adapt to these marriages. Some found solace in their children, while others learned to use their roles as wives and mothers to navigate their complex relationships with their husbands. Yet, even in these cases, the shadow of forced marriage loomed large, as women were never truly free to choose their own path. Their lives were dictated by the wills of others, and their personal desires and ambitions were sacrificed for the sake of family or political duty. In the medieval world, a woman's role in marriage was deeply tied to her ability to bear children, particularly male heirs. For noble women, the pressure to produce heirs was immense. They were married young and often faced the grave expectation of immediately fulfilling their duty to their husbands and their families. Childbirth, however, was a dangerous endeavor, particularly in the harsh conditions of medieval times, where medical knowledge was limited and the risks of complications during labor were high. A woman's body was not seen as her own, but as a vessel for reproduction, and society expected her to bear children as quickly as possible. In some cases, the very health and well-being of women were sacrificed in the name of ensuring the survival of noble bloodlines. The risks associated with childbirth were so great that many women died giving birth to the heirs they were expected to produce. Childbirth was a physically demanding process that left many women permanently scarred, emotionally and physically. The trauma of bearing children was not only exhausting but also dangerous, as many women succumbed to infections, hemorrhages, or childbirth-related injuries. Despite these risks, the pressure to bear children never ceased. Women were expected to bear child after child, sometimes at the cost of their own lives or health. A woman's worth was often reduced to her ability to reproduce, and if she failed to produce an heir, her position in the family and her marriage could be jeopardized. In many noble households, the birth of a son was a particularly celebrated event, as it ensured the continuation of the family line. Women who failed to provide sons were often blamed for their inability to fulfill this duty, and the consequences could be dire. Husbands could take multiple wives, seek mistresses, or even seek annulments, blaming their wives for failing to produce a male heir. These women were often left to suffer in silence, their pain and suffering ignored by the very society that placed these unrealistic expectations on them. The emotional and physical toll of repeated pregnancies and childbirth left many women feeling isolated, powerless, and unable to express their personal needs or desires. The constant fear of death during childbirth and the societal pressure to bear children created an environment of emotional and physical suffering for women. Despite the luxury of their noble status, women in medieval marriages were often nothing more than reproductive machines, forced to put aside their own needs and bodies for the sake of family legacy. The emotional toll of medieval marriages, particularly for women, was profound and often ignored. From the moment women were married off, they were expected to become everything their husbands desired, fulfilling the duties of wife, mother, and noblewoman. These roles were not just expectations, but demands that left women little room for personal growth or expression. The emotional strain of living in a marriage that was not based on love but on duty created a great deal of psychological stress for many women. Their entire lives were controlled by their husbands, families, and society, and they were rarely given the opportunity to explore their own desires or find personal fulfillment. The emotional isolation experienced by women in medieval marriages was often profound. They were rarely allowed to form close relationships outside their immediate family or household. Even the emotional bonds they shared with their children were often shaped by duty and expectation rather than affection. Women in medieval marriages were expected to be quiet, obedient, and submissive, suppressing any feelings of discontent or frustration. The psychological strain this placed on them was immense, as they had to navigate a world that valued their physical appearance, ability to bear children, and their role as the dutiful wife, but rarely valued them as individuals with their own thoughts, desires, and dreams. The inability to freely express their emotions or personal needs created a sense of internal conflict for many women. They were expected to be content with their roles, yet the restrictions placed on them often caused resentment. Their marriages were not spaces where they could find comfort or companionship, but arenas where they had to prove their worth by fulfilling societal expectations. Many women found themselves trapped in their roles, unable to seek happiness or personal freedom. This emotional confinement created a deep sense of loneliness, as women were expected to repress their desires for companionship and affection. For many, their marriages were characterized not by mutual love and respect, but by obligation and fear of social reprisal. The psychological strain was worsened by the constant pressure to perform their duties flawlessly, all while maintaining a facade of grace and composure. Despite this, some women learned to adapt to their marriages in subtle ways, using their intellect, charm, or influence to navigate the confines of their roles. However, for most, the psychological toll of living a life defined by the expectations of others left them emotionally exhausted and mentally drained. The absence of personal agency and emotional fulfillment in their marriages often resulted in a profound sense of sadness, resentment, and emotional isolation that could last a lifetime. The medieval church had a profound influence on every aspect of life, and marriage was no exception. In fact, the church held ultimate authority over marriage, dictating not just the ceremonies, but the very meaning and purpose behind them. Marriage was not merely a social contract. It was considered a sacred institution, one ordained by God. The church defined the roles of both husbands and wives, often reinforcing the idea that a wife's role was one of obedience and submission, as dictated by divine will. The church's teachings also emphasized that marriage was not about love or personal fulfillment, but about duty, procreation, and the continuation of the family lineage. This view perpetuated a cycle where the emotional needs of women were ignored, and they were instead taught to focus solely on their duties to their husbands and families. The influence of the church on medieval marriages was extensive. Church officials not only oversaw the marriage ceremonies, but also provided the moral and theological justification for the patriarchal structures of society. For women, the church reinforced the idea that their role in marriage was to serve their husbands, and that they should accept this subjugation as their divine duty. The idea of marital love, as we understand it today, was largely absent. Instead, the church placed greater importance on the idea of chastity, duty, and obedience. Women were expected to be pure, virginal before marriage, and sexually available to their husbands afterward in order to fulfill the purpose of bearing children. The church's rigid stance on marriage and the roles of women in these unions created a powerful force that kept women in line, ensuring that they complied with the strict social structures and patriarchal expectations. Despite the heavy-handed influence of the church, it was not entirely without its contradictions. While the church preached the sanctity of marriage and the importance of fidelity, it also provided the means for men to extricate themselves from marriages they no longer found beneficial. Divorce was strictly forbidden by the church, but annulments could be granted under certain circumstances, often favoring men. This created an environment where men held ultimate control over their marriages, while women were left with little recourse. If a woman failed to produce a male heir, or if her husband grew tired of her, he could seek an annulment, essentially ending the marriage with the church's blessing. Women, however, had no such option to escape the confines of their marriages, regardless of their personal suffering or the emotional isolation they endured. The church's influence in marriage also extended to the moral guidance it provided, teaching that women's greatest virtue was their devotion to their husbands and children. Women were seen as caretakers of the home, and their value was tied to their ability to support their husbands' ambitions and fulfill their maternal roles. While the church's teachings gave women no room to assert personal desires or ambitions, they did create an ideal of virtuous womanhood that many women felt pressured to live up to. The church's unyielding control over medieval marriages ensured that women remained trapped in marriages where their personal happiness was sacrificed for the greater social and religious good. The teachings of the church thus perpetuated the emotional and psychological suffering of women, reinforcing their position as obedient wives and mothers. Marriage in medieval times was not just about love or companionship, it was a tool for acquiring power, status, and wealth. For noble families, marriage was a means to strengthen alliances, secure land, and ensure political survival. The concept of love had little to do with these unions. Instead, marriage was a political contract, where women were married off to the highest bidder, or to families who could offer the best economic or political advantage. Women were expected to serve as instruments of social advancement, their value tied not to their personal qualities, but to the wealth and power their marriage could bring. The political nature of marriage meant that love had no place in the equation. A woman's happiness was irrelevant in the face of securing wealth or land for her family. For noble women, marriage was often a transaction. Their worth was determined by the dowry they brought to the table, which could be substantial in terms of land, money, or valuable assets. Marrying into a wealthy family or one with political power could elevate a woman's status, but it also meant that her autonomy was compromised. She became a political pawn, subject to the whims of her husband and his family. In many cases, noble women had no say in their choice of partner. They were often betrothed at a young age, their futures decided by their fathers and brothers, who saw the marriage as a means to increase the family's wealth and influence. Love, affection, or even mutual respect were secondary to the political advantages that could be gained. While marriage could be a source of power and status, it also came with significant risks. For women, the prospect of being married off to a man they did not love or even a man they did not know was terrifying. Marriage was often a gamble, one that could have lasting consequences for a woman's personal happiness and well-being. Despite this, women had little choice in the matter. They were expected to submit to the will of their fathers and husbands, even if it meant enduring a loveless or abusive marriage. The marriage contract was often skewed in favor of men, with women having little recourse should the union prove harmful or unfulfilling. A woman could not easily leave a marriage, nor could she assert any significant power within it. The very nature of medieval marriage left women vulnerable, caught between the political machinations of their families and the patriarchal expectations of their husbands. Their status as wives was inherently tied to the power and influence of their husbands, and their primary function was to support their family's wealth and status through marriage. As such, women were trapped in a system where their personal desires and needs were constantly overshadowed by the pursuit of political and economic power. Medieval marriages, particularly among the nobility, were not merely private affairs, but were subjected to intense public scrutiny. The reputations of both husband and wife were tied to their marriage, and any misstep could bring ruin to the family name. For women, this scrutiny was often relentless, as their every move was closely monitored by society. The pressure to maintain an image of purity, virtue, and obedience was immense. Women were expected to uphold their family's honor by embodying the ideal of the perfect wife, a role that often left them little room for personal expression or freedom. The consequences of failing to uphold this reputation could be severe, with women risking social exile, disinheritance, or even worse, the ruin of their entire family's social standing. For men, marriage was often viewed as a reflection of their power, status, and ability to control their household. The failure to manage one's wife or family properly could be seen as a sign of weakness, and any scandal that arose within the marriage reflected poorly on the husband. However, it was women who bore the brunt of public criticism. Their behavior, dress, speech, and even their manners were scrutinized, and a single misstep could result in being labeled as immoral or unworthy of their husband's name. A woman's reputation was tied to her role as a wife, and any hint of infidelity, defiance, or misbehavior could lead to her being cast out of society's favor. Her every action was a reflection of her family's honor, and the pressure to meet these expectations was suffocating. This societal obsession with reputation also meant that marriages were often forced into the public eye. The details of a noblewoman's marriage, whether her husband was faithful, whether she produced heirs, and whether she maintained her duties, were common gossip among the upper classes. Women's worth was often measured by their ability to live up to the idealized image of a loyal, submissive wife, and any deviation from this role could invite harsh judgment from both the court and the common people. In this sense, medieval women were not just expected to live for themselves or their husbands, they were expected to live for the public's approval. Their very identity was shaped by the perception of others, and their marriages were a stage upon which the performance of their lives was enacted, judged, and critiqued by all. The constant scrutiny and judgment placed on women created a deep sense of anxiety and pressure. Many women who were married for political or social reasons struggled to live up to the impossible ideals that were imposed upon them. For those who found themselves in unhappy or abusive marriages, the public perception of their marriage added an extra layer of suffering. A woman's distress was often invisible to the outside world. Instead, society demanded that she maintain the facade of the perfect wife, hiding her pain behind a mask of dutiful submission. The burden of reputation was a heavy one to bear, and for many women, it was a lifelong struggle to navigate the expectations placed upon them while maintaining their sense of self. In the medieval world, divorce was an option for men, but an almost impossible prospect for women. While the Church held firm that marriage was a sacred union, there were exceptions, and in some cases, men could petition for an annulment or divorce. However, this right was not equally available to both spouses. For men, divorce or annulment was often a simple matter of proving that the marriage was politically unbeneficial or that their wife had failed to produce an heir. For women, however, divorce was nearly out of reach. The Church's teachings emphasized the indissolubility of marriage, and while men could navigate the annulment process with relative ease, women were rarely granted the same opportunity. The power imbalance in divorce laws mirrored the broader gender inequality in medieval society. Men could use divorce or annulment to free themselves from a marriage that was no longer beneficial to their interests, while women were trapped in marriages that were often arranged for political, economic, or social reasons. If a woman was unhappy in her marriage, whether due to abuse, neglect, or emotional detachment, she had few options. The legal system, heavily influenced by church doctrine, offered no protection for her. Women were expected to endure their marriages, regardless of how emotionally or physically damaging they might be. This unequal access to divorce meant that women had to endure suffering within their marriages. They could not seek an escape from the emotional, physical, or psychological torment of an unhappy or abusive marriage. If a woman's husband was unfaithful or cruel, she had little recourse to change her situation. The lack of divorce options left many women in marriages that were oppressive and debilitating, with no possibility of relief. Women who sought to leave their husbands often faced social ostracism, religious condemnation, and even legal punishment. The Church's teachings on the sanctity of marriage prevented women from finding freedom in a marriage that had turned toxic or unbearable. Despite these limitations, some women found ways to navigate the system. Some sought to influence the annulment process through powerful families or political connections. Others remained in their marriages, enduring the suffering and finding solace in their children or in the quieter moments of their lives. However, for most women, the reality of marriage in the medieval period meant that they were trapped, with no avenue for escape. The inability to access divorce or annulment created an environment of emotional and psychological suffering that women were forced to endure throughout their lives, with no hope of relief from the confines of a marriage they could not control. In the medieval world, the influence of mothers on the marital lives of their children, particularly daughters, was a significant force. Although the concept of romantic love was rarely considered in the marriage decisions of the time, the emotional weight placed on family and social duty could not be overstated. Mothers, especially those in noble families, were often the key decision-makers when it came to their daughters' marriages. They were responsible for ensuring that their daughters married into powerful, wealthy, or politically advantageous families. A mother's ambition for her daughter's future often centered on the protection and elevation of family status, wealth, and alliances, which meant that daughters were frequently married off at a young age to fulfill these goals. The mother's role was complicated by both affection and pragmatism. On one hand, a mother would undoubtedly want the best for her daughter, perhaps imagining that a marriage with a powerful suitor would bring wealth, comfort, and political security. On the other hand, mothers knew that daughters were essentially pawns in the larger game of dynastic survival. Their emotions were often secondary to the needs of the family. Mothers in noble families were not always interested in their daughters' emotional or physical well-being. Instead, their focus was often directed towards securing a good match that would serve the family's interests. The pressure placed on daughters was enormous, as they were required to uphold their family's honor and lineage, often at the cost of their personal desires or happiness. What's more, mothers were frequently the ones who emphasized the expectations placed on their daughters. They would teach them how to behave, how to control their emotions, and how to fulfill the duties expected of them once married. The lessons imparted to young girls about marriage were often harsh, focusing on submission, duty, and the need to endure suffering for the sake of family stability. Mothers would teach their daughters that the marital bond was primarily about preserving the family legacy, not about finding love or companionship. This generational cycle of emotional suppression, passed down from mothers to daughters, ensured that medieval marriages remained a powerful tool for social, political, and economic power regardless of the personal toll it exacted on women. The medieval mother's complex role in arranging her daughter's marriage is a paradox. She was a guardian of family legacy but also a source of emotional conflict for her daughter, as she too was trapped in the same patriarchal systems. Mothers often had little power to resist the social expectations of marriage themselves, making it nearly impossible to pass on any alternative view to their daughters. The notion that marriage was an essential duty, regardless of individual desire, became ingrained in the minds of young girls from an early age. The deep emotional and psychological toll of forced marriages was often unspoken in medieval society. Women, particularly those from noble families, were married off to men they did not love, often at a young age and with little to no say in the matter. For many of these women, the marriage was a cold, transactional event, where their personal desires and feelings were disregarded in favor of family politics and social status. These marriages were not unions of love, but were instead alliances designed to preserve family wealth, power, and influence. As such, women had to endure their new lives with a sense of resignation, bitterness, or even silent resentment. While these feelings were rarely spoken about in public, they were certainly present in the private lives of many women. The reality of living in a marriage where there was no affection or connection was a source of deep pain and frustration. Women were expected to be obedient to their husbands, producing heirs and fulfilling their duties as wives, without ever considering their own happiness. This lack of emotional fulfillment in marriage created a profound sense of isolation for many women. They were often physically alone, with little emotional support from their husbands or families. The societal expectations that women should endure their marriages, no matter how difficult, left little room for them to express their dissatisfaction or desire for change. The resentment that often simmered under the surface of these forced marriages could manifest in different ways. Some women found solace in their children, focusing all their love and affection on them in an effort to find meaning in their lives. Others turned to their social circle, finding companionship in friends or distant family members. However, the majority of women had to suppress their resentment, knowing that any open expression of dissatisfaction could lead to their ostracism or even punishment. The lack of agency in their marriages left them with no recourse for seeking the fulfillment or happiness they so desperately wanted. The deep and silent resentment experienced by many women in medieval marriages is a reflection of the emotional toll that the institution of marriage took on them. These women lived in a world where their emotions were secondary to the social and political needs of their families. They were expected to endure, to perform their duties without question, and to sacrifice their personal desires for the good of the family or kingdom. For many, this meant a lifetime of emotional suffering, loneliness, and unexpressed frustration. In medieval marriages, children played a pivotal role in perpetuating family legacy, power, and wealth. For noble families, the primary goal of marriage was often to produce heirs who would carry on the family name and inherit the land and titles. This pressure was particularly intense for women, who were expected to bear children, especially sons, to ensure the continuation of the family lineage. The birth of a son was often seen as the ultimate proof of a successful marriage, while the failure to produce an heir could lead to scorn and ruin. In some cases, a noble woman's worth was measured by her ability to bear children, and her role as a wife was reduced to that of a childbearer and caretaker, with little room for personal ambition or desires. The desire for children, particularly male heirs, drove much of the social and political dynamics within marriages. Women who failed to produce heirs were sometimes blamed for the inability to carry on the family name. In some instances, this failure could lead to divorce or annulment, as the primary purpose of marriage, the creation of heirs, was not fulfilled. Men, on the other hand, could marry multiple times or take mistresses in order to ensure that they had children, sometimes ignoring the emotional suffering of their wives in the process. The burden of childbearing often fell squarely on women, who had to endure the physical toll of pregnancy, childbirth, and childcare without the support of modern medical care. Despite the harsh realities, some women found comfort and purpose in their children. In a society where their worth was often determined by their ability to fulfill their familial duties, having children could provide women with a sense of accomplishment. A woman who gave birth to a son could find some measure of pride in the continuation of her bloodline, even if her own happiness was sacrificed. For many medieval women, children were the only outlet for emotional expression and the only source of love and affection in their otherwise constrained lives. Children also had a significant role in the marriages of noble families, as they were seen as instruments of political power. A well-married daughter could forge alliances with other noble houses, while a son could be groomed to inherit land, titles, and responsibility. These children, while loved, were also treated as pawns in the game of dynastic survival. Parents often saw their children's marriages as strategic moves, designed to secure the family's future, and the pressure to marry well was placed upon them from a young age. Beneath the outward displays of wealth, power, and status, the lives of many medieval wives were filled with hidden suffering. Women, especially those in arranged marriages, were often trapped in relationships where their emotional and physical well-being was secondary to the social and political needs of their families. These marriages were rarely about mutual affection or personal happiness. Instead, women were expected to fulfill their roles as obedient wives and mothers, regardless of how much personal sacrifice it required. The emotional suffering of these women was often invisible to the outside world, as they were expected to hide their pain and present a facade of dutiful submission. For many medieval wives, the emotional isolation of marriage was a harsh reality. Women were often confined to their homes, responsible for managing the household and raising children, while their husbands were free to pursue their own interests and often maintained political and social connections outside the home. Wives, particularly those married to powerful men, were often left in the shadows, their lives controlled by their husbands and their families. While the men enjoyed social mobility and power, the wives were expected to remain behind the scenes, fulfilling their roles as caretakers and supporters. This emotional isolation was compounded by the physical toll of childbirth. In medieval times, childbirth was a dangerous and often life-threatening event. Women were expected to bear children frequently, with little regard for their health or well-being. The lack of proper medical care and the high risks associated with childbirth meant that many women lived in constant fear of death during their pregnancies. Women who did survive childbirth were often left physically weakened and vulnerable, with little support from their husbands who were preoccupied with their own affairs. The psychological toll of living in such an environment was immense. Many women felt trapped in their marriages, unable to escape the emotional and physical burdens placed upon them. The societal expectation that women should endure these hardships without complaint further isolated them, leaving them with few opportunities to express their suffering. This hidden suffering was compounded by the rigid gender roles that defined women's lives. They were expected to be silent, obedient, and subservient, and any deviation from this expectation could result in social ostracism or punishment. The emotional and physical toll of medieval marriage was often hidden behind closed doors, and for many women, it became a lifelong struggle to navigate a world where their personal desires and well-being were sacrificed for the good of their families and society. Medieval marriages were rarely about love. Instead, they were tools for political gain and power consolidation. For noble families, marriage was often the key to securing alliances, expanding territories, and ensuring the survival of the family lineage. These unions were carefully negotiated, with dowries, titles, and land exchanges at the forefront of the discussions. The individuals involved had little say in the matter, as their personal feelings and desires were irrelevant in comparison to the political and social needs of their families. The concept of romantic love was alien to most, and marriages were seen as business transactions, where loyalty, wealth, and power were the currencies exchanged. For women, especially those from noble or royal families, marriage was an expected part of their duty. They were married off not for love or personal happiness, but to fulfill their family's political ambitions. Marrying into another powerful family was seen as a way to strengthen one's position within the kingdom and ensure that alliances were maintained for generations. Often, a woman's marriage would be arranged when she was still a child, and her feelings were not considered in the decision-making process. It was a simple reality that women had little control over the unions arranged for them. Their personal happiness was secondary to the survival and advancement of the family. Men, on the other hand, saw marriage as a way to solidify their position within the political landscape. A well-placed marriage could secure important alliances, grant access to new lands, and provide a much-needed advantage in the cutthroat world of medieval politics. Some men, particularly kings and nobles, could have multiple wives or mistresses, each union carefully chosen to serve political and economic purposes. The power of marriage to secure political leverage was one of the primary reasons why medieval women were often treated as pawns in these alliances, rather than as partners in a loving union. Their role was not one of affection, but of service to the dynastic goals of their families. Marriages, however, could sometimes backfire. If the political union did not work out as planned, or if a marriage failed to produce an heir, the consequences could be catastrophic. A failed marriage could weaken alliances, spark wars, and lead to a loss of power. For women, this often meant living in a volatile and uncertain world, where their marriages were subject to the whims of political tides. If a marriage was dissolved, a woman could lose not only her social standing but also her home, her wealth, and her family's favor. It was a dangerous game that many women played, with their fates tied to the success or failure of political marriages that were out of their control. Medieval marriages often reduced individuals, especially women, to little more than property, their worth measured by their ability to produce heirs and fulfill societal expectations. These marriages were not unions of equals but hierarchical relationships in which the husband held all the power. Women were expected to obey their husbands without question, performing the duties of wife and mother with little regard for their personal happiness. In this patriarchal society, women had few legal rights and were often considered the property of their husbands. Their status was defined by their marital connection, and their sense of identity was shaped by their role as wives and mothers. The dehumanizing aspect of medieval marriage was particularly evident in how women were treated as vessels for reproduction. A woman's worth was often tied to her ability to bear children, and if she failed to produce heirs, she could be cast aside in favor of another wife or mistress who could fulfill that duty. Women were seen as tools for the perpetuation of family lines, rather than as individuals with their own desires and needs. Their personal ambitions and dreams were secondary to their role in maintaining the family name and ensuring its survival. Men, on the other hand, held all the power in these unions. They could control their wives' lives and decide their fate. They had the ability to take multiple wives or mistresses if their first marriage did not produce the desired heir, while their wives had no such freedom. A woman's ability to resist or escape a marriage was nearly non-existent, as the church and society at large expected her to fulfill her duties as a wife and mother without complaint. This dehumanizing control over women extended to nearly every aspect of their lives, from their clothing to their behavior to their sexuality. The expectation that women should be submissive and obedient was not just a cultural norm, it was a societal mandate. The legal and social structures in medieval Europe reinforced the idea that marriage was a man's domain. Women had little power over their own lives, and their bodies were seen as property to be controlled and used for reproduction. The patriarchal nature of medieval marriage left women vulnerable to abuse, neglect, and emotional suffering, as they had few options for seeking help or relief. The dehumanizing treatment of women in medieval marriages was a stark reminder of how power dynamics shaped every aspect of life, with women's needs and desires often ignored in favor of men's authority and control. One of the most significant aspects of medieval marriage, particularly in noble circles, was the dowry. A dowry was a financial arrangement made by the bride's family to secure the marriage. While it was often portrayed as a gesture of goodwill or as a means of honoring the union, the reality was far darker. For many families, a dowry was not a voluntary gift, but a necessary price to ensure their daughter's marriage, particularly if she was married into a higher social rank. The dowry could be anything from land, money, jewels, or even political favors. The larger the dowry, the more advantageous the marriage was considered, and the higher the social standing of the family. For women, the dowry was a heavy burden. Not only did it diminish their value as individuals, but it also signified their family's control over them. A daughter's worth was often measured by the size of her dowry, and this monetary value had a huge impact on the level of influence a woman would have in her marriage. If a woman's dowry was small, or if her family could not afford a substantial one, she might find herself married to a man who saw her only as a means to gain wealth or land, rather than a partner to share a life with. The dowry system also created a financial strain on many families. In noble families, securing a marriage often meant depleting a large portion of their wealth. Fathers would often go into debt or sell off valuable land in order to ensure their daughters were married into powerful families. This financial strain was not just a one-time expense, but a long-term commitment that could potentially ruin families financially if the marriage did not go as planned. In some cases, marriages failed, leaving the woman trapped in a failed union, while the family was left with the remnants of a financial transaction gone wrong. Additionally, the dowry system created an unequal power dynamic. Women were married off not for love or companionship, but for economic or political gain. They were seen as commodities, and the dowry was a way to secure their place in society. The dowry system, while a social norm at the time, placed an immense burden on women, reducing them to little more than assets to be traded between families. Marriage in the medieval period was deeply intertwined with politics, often at the expense of personal happiness. Political marriages were designed to secure power, form alliances, and consolidate wealth and land. These unions were not about the emotional connection between the bride and groom, but rather about ensuring the survival and prosperity of noble houses. These marriages could make or break the fate of entire kingdoms, and the individuals involved were often seen as mere tools to further the ambitions of their families. For women, political marriages were particularly dangerous. The pressure to marry into powerful families was immense, and the consequences of failing to secure the right marriage could be catastrophic. Women who married into less powerful or influential families could find themselves in precarious situations, with their positions and safety compromised. A woman's role was often reduced to a symbolic one, serving as a pawn in the game of dynastic politics. She was expected to provide heirs, maintain her household, and uphold her family's reputation duties that often overshadowed her own desires and well-being. Political marriages could also expose women to the dangers of courtly intrigues and betrayal. As marriages were frequently arranged between rival factions, women often found themselves in hostile environments where they were expected to navigate complex webs of alliances and rivalries. These alliances could shift at any moment, and a woman who found herself married into the wrong political faction could be left isolated and vulnerable without the support of her family or allies. Men, too, were not immune to the dangers of political marriages. While they typically had more agency in choosing their spouses, they were still subject to the shifting tides of politics. A marriage that initially appeared to be a powerful alliance could quickly turn sour if the political situation changed. A man could find himself betrayed by his wife's family or caught in the crossfire of a political feud, with his life and position in danger. These marriages could make enemies just as easily as they made allies, and many noble families lost their wealth, power, and influence due to ill-fated political unions. Medieval marriages were not just unions of two people. They were the binding forces of entire families, whose decisions overshadowed personal desires and feelings. For women, these marriages often represented the ultimate loss of autonomy. Once a woman was married, she was expected to surrender not just her heart, but her voice, her choices, and her personal ambitions. As soon as the vows were spoken, a woman's life was no longer her own. Her role as wife and mother became her entire identity. The authority of her husband and the interests of her family eclipsed any notion of personal freedom, and her every move, thought, and action was scrutinized by the societal expectations placed upon her. For many women, the act of marriage symbolized a transformation from a daughter under the rule of her father to a wife under the dominance of her husband. In this transition, they moved from one form of captivity to another. Wives had no control over their own bodies, finances, or future. It was the husband who controlled all aspects of their life, from the household to the children to the wealth or lack thereof. Women were legally considered the property of their husbands, and this lack of agency trapped them in loveless, often abusive relationships. A medieval woman had few ways to escape her circumstances, as divorce was an arduous and rare process, and being left alone without the support of her family or community often meant ruin. The lack of autonomy was particularly harsh when it came to the social sphere. Women had no opportunity to voice their opinions publicly, nor were they given the same respect or rights as men in matters of inheritance or land ownership. A woman's worth was tied to her marriage and her role as a mother. The rights to her land, title, or wealth were often transferred to her husband upon marriage, leaving her powerless in the management of her own affairs. If her husband died, the property was typically inherited by his heirs or relatives, not her. Marriage, therefore, became a binding contract that allowed women little freedom to pursue their own goals. The idea of self-actualization or independence was foreign to many women in medieval society. Their lives, instead, were shaped by the needs and desires of the men in their lives. While some women managed to carve out limited opportunities for influence, their power was always bound by the confines of marriage, and their autonomy was constantly challenged by the demands of their societal roles. For most women, the impact of marriage was a loss of independence, and in a world where power rested in the hands of men, this lack of autonomy was one of the harshest aspects of medieval life. In the medieval period, marriage was not just a private matter, it was a public declaration of status, wealth, and societal position. An unsuccessful marriage, whether due to lack of love, infidelity, or failure to produce an heir, was seen as a profound failure, not just of the individuals involved, but also of their families. For women, the consequences of an unsuccessful marriage were severe. Divorce was practically unheard of, and annulments were granted only in rare cases, often under extreme circumstances. This left many women trapped in marriages where their happiness, health, and well-being were sacrificed for the sake of family reputation or societal expectations. The social stigma of an unsuccessful marriage was immense. Women who found themselves in unhappy or unfulfilling marriages were often left with little recourse. Their worth was still measured by their ability to maintain a successful union, and failure to do so could result in shame and public disgrace. If a woman's marriage was deemed unsuccessful, she could face the harsh judgment of her community. The failure to bear children, the lack of affection between spouses, or any signs of conflict within the marriage were often seen as a reflection of the woman's inability to fulfill her role. Society placed the blame for marital failure squarely on the shoulders of women, reinforcing the belief that it was their responsibility to maintain harmony in the home. For men, the social stigma of an unsuccessful marriage was less severe, but it still carried consequences. A failed marriage could reflect poorly on a man's ability to manage his household, or could be seen as a sign of weakness or incompetence. The inability to produce heirs, or the failure to maintain a strong alliance through marriage, could lead to a loss of prestige and status. Men, however, were often more able to recover from an unsuccessful marriage by taking on another wife or mistress, whereas women had fewer options for redemption. In both cases, however, the societal pressure to maintain a successful marriage was immense. For women, the consequences of failing in this regard were often more far-reaching, as their entire social standing and reputation were tied to the success of their marital union. This created a culture of silence, where many women remained in unfulfilling marriages, enduring emotional and physical suffering simply to avoid the shame and stigma associated with failure. The social pressure to maintain a successful marriage became another source of suffering for women in the medieval period, making the institution of marriage a trap from which there was often no escape. Religion played a dominant role in shaping the institution of marriage in the medieval world. The Church's teachings and beliefs were not only a guiding force in people's spiritual lives, but also heavily influenced their social and marital lives. Marriage was seen as a sacred union ordained by God, and it was the Church that had the power to bless or annul these unions. The very idea of marriage was rooted in religious doctrine, and for many, the thought of breaking their marriage vows was considered a sin. However, the influence of religion was not always for the benefit of those involved, especially for women, who found themselves bound by religious expectations that were designed to uphold patriarchal power structures. The Church's stance on marriage was clear. It was a sacred covenant that could only be dissolved under the most extreme circumstances, often involving death or infidelity. Divorce was not an option for most couples, and annulments were granted only in rare cases where the marriage was deemed invalid for religious reasons. For women, this meant that they had little recourse if they found themselves in an unhappy or abusive marriage. Their fates were often tied to the whims of their husbands and the religious authorities that upheld the sanctity of marriage. Even in cases where a woman was suffering, her only option was to endure, as the Church emphasized the duty of women to remain in their marriages and fulfill their roles as wives and mothers. The Church also played a key role in determining who could marry. For nobles, the Church's approval was required to ensure that the marriage was considered legitimate and that the children produced from the union were recognized as heirs. In some cases, marriages were arranged for political or dynastic reasons, with the Church serving as a legitimizing authority to ensure that these unions were recognized by both society and the law. The Church's involvement in marriage not only enforced the idea that marriage was a sacred institution, but also reinforced the notion that individuals, particularly women, had little agency in the matter. Their role was to submit to God's will as interpreted by the Church, which often meant sacrificing personal happiness and freedom for the greater good of their family and faith. In some cases, women did find support within religious institutions, especially if they were widowed or abandoned. The Church offered refuge for women who had nowhere else to turn, and nuns could find a form of spiritual independence within convents. However, this was not always the case. For many women, the Church's teachings on marriage served as a reminder of their subjugation and the lack of choice they had in matters of love and companionship. Religion, while offering solace in some instances, also reinforced the patriarchal framework that dictated women's lives, including their marriages. The legacy of medieval marriages can still be seen in modern societies, where the echoes of those ancient unions resonate in the cultural, legal, and social structures we navigate today. Medieval marriages were often the result of political maneuvering and family interests, and while they may seem distant from our conceptions of love and partnership, they shaped the way we view marriage as an institution. In many ways, marriage was a transactionone that involved not just the joining of two individuals, but the consolidation of power, land, and wealth. The modern concept of love-based marriages, where individuals choose their partners based on affection and personal connection, stands in stark contrast to the politically motivated unions of medieval times. Even today, some aspects of medieval marriage still influence the institution. The idea of a dowry, although it has evolved, still exists in some cultures, where families provide a financial or material gift to ensure the marriage's success. Furthermore, the concept of marriage as a union of two families, rather than two individuals, persists in many parts of the world, where family approval and social status still play a significant role in determining marital success. The legacy of medieval marriage can also be seen in the way that legal systems still prioritize the protection of property rights in marriage, and the traditional roles of men and women within marriage continue to affect how relationships are viewed in society. The story of medieval marriage is one of power, control, and survival. For women, it was often a struggle for independence in a world that saw them as tools for political and economic gain. Their marriages were not about love, but about duty, and their lives were shaped by the needs and desires of their families and the society around them. While we may look back on these marriages with a sense of horror or disbelief, they were the norm in medieval times and played a crucial role in shaping the world we live in today. As we reflect on these unions, it's important to remember that the institution of marriage was once a contract, not just between two people, but between families, communities, and kingdoms. The medieval marriage was not a romantic ideal, but a necessary arrangement for survival and power. Though the institution has evolved, its roots in the past continue to shape our ideas of love, commitment, and partnership. The legacy of medieval marriages, with all their complexities and struggles, is a reminder of how far society has come and how far we still have to go in ensuring that love, not power or politics, governs our unions.